Sunday, the FBI confirmed it is monitoring Iranian operatives positioned near 8 American nuclear facilities, not investigating whether they exist, monitoring operatives already identified. The testimony came from FBI Director Allen Marsh before the Senate Intelligence Committee 3 days ago. The operatives are under active surveillance. Their communication networks have been mapped. Their daily patterns are documented, and the FBI has made the decision not to arrest a single one of them. That is not a leak. That is sworn testimony now on the public record. The question is not whether Iranian operatives are near American nuclear plants. The question is why American intelligence has decided that watching them is safer than stopping them. If you live within 50 miles of a nuclear facility, the calculation that FBI leadership has made directly affects your risk profile. If you have been following the tension between Washington and Tehran for the past 18 months, this surveillance decision is the clearest signal yet of how American intelligence is reading Iranian intent. Most coverage treated this story as a security failure. They are asking why the operatives were not arrested the moment they were identified. That is the wrong question. The FBI does not lack the authority or capability to arrest foreign intelligence operatives conducting surveillance on critical infrastructure. When the FBI chooses surveillance over interdiction, that choice tells you exactly what they believe will happen if those operatives are touched. What is at stake is not whether the threat is real. What is at stake is whether the American public understands that their government has already accepted a specific threat posture, because every alternative produces an outcome worse than the current state. If you want to understand not just the presence of these operatives, but the strategic calculation that keeps them free and monitored instead of arrested and expelled, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Let us go through this completely. Let us start with the Senate Intelligence Committee testimony from Thursday, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. FBI Director Allen Marsh testified under oath that the Bureau has identified and is actively monitoring individuals with confirmed ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, positioned within operational range of 8 commercial nuclear power facilities across the United States. The specific phrase he used was operational range, not proximity, not vicinity, operational range. That is the language of threat assessment, not geographic description. Operational range means the distance from which an individual can conduct meaningful surveillance, coordinate external activity, or serve as a relay point for information or material. When the director uses that phrase in sworn testimony, he is confirming that the positioning is deliberate and that the FBI has assessed what those positions enable. The revelation is not that Iranian intelligence is attempting to gather information on American nuclear infrastructure. The revelation is that the FBI has mapped the network, identified the operatives, and chosen not to disrupt it. The second piece comes from DHS threat briefings circulated to state and local fusion centers over the past 6 weeks. Documents obtained through public disclosure requests show that Homeland Security has been quietly briefing state-level law enforcement on what they are calling pattern-based surveillance detection near critical energy infrastructure. The briefings do not name Iran specifically, but the geographic overlap is absolute. All 8 facilities referenced in FBI Director Marsh's testimony appear in the DHS briefing materials. The briefings instruct local law enforcement to document, but not interdict individuals matching specific behavioral profiles. The language is careful. Document license plates. Note presence duration. Report communication equipment. But the instruction is explicit. Do not approach. Do not question. Do not detain. That is not guidance you issue when you are trying to catch someone. That is guidance you issue when you are trying to avoid spooking someone you are already watching from a different angle. The scale of the coordination is the third piece. Cross-referenced against commercial nuclear reactor locations, population density maps, and interstate highway access, the 8 facilities form a specific pattern. They are not the 8 most vulnerable reactors. They are the 8 whose disruption or threatened disruption would produce the widest geographic and economic impact with the least operational difficulty. 3 are within 20 miles of major metropolitan areas. 2 are positioned on critical electrical grid interchanges. The site selection is not about attacking the reactors. It is about holding them. The positioning tells you that someone sat down with infrastructure maps and identified which facilities would give them maximum deterrence value if credibly threatened. Iranian intelligence is not preparing to sabotage American nuclear plants. They are preparing to demonstrate that they can. And the FBI has concluded that arresting the operatives would force Iran to prove the capability instead of simply holding it in reserve. The operatives themselves are not the weapon. The surveillance infrastructure is the weapon. What the coverage is missing completely is the decision calculus that makes arrests counterproductive. When an intelligence agency surveils a threat without interdicting it, that agency has already determined that interdiction accelerates the threat instead of neutralizing it. The framework is simple. If arrest produces replacement with operatives you cannot identify, surveillance is the superior option. If arrest triggers a contingency protocol you cannot counter, surveillance is the superior option. If arrest forces an adversary to prove a capability they would otherwise hold as deterrent, surveillance is the superior option. In all 3 cases, the decision to watch instead of act is not weakness. It is threat management. In this specific situation, the framework explains why the FBI briefed Congress instead of moving to arrest. Briefing the Senate Intelligence Committee creates a public record of awareness without creating a public demand for immediate action. It signals to Tehran that the network is compromised without forcing Washington to dismantle it. The message is calibrated. We see you, we are watching, and we are choosing not to escalate because we understand what escalation produces. That is not a message you send through diplomatic channels. That is a message you send by demonstrating operational awareness and strategic restraint simultaneously. The framework tells you that the testimony itself is part of the surveillance strategy. Director Marsh was not informing Congress of a threat they needed to act on. He was informing Congress of a threat that acting on would worsen. The framework applies to a separate event from 6 months ago that most people have forgotten. In October, the Department of Energy quietly revised security protocols at commercial nuclear facilities to require secondary verification of all contracted maintenance personnel, even those with existing clearances. The revision applied to electrical systems, cooling infrastructure, and perimeter security networks. No public explanation was given. The framework tells you different. If Iranian intelligence has positioned external operatives near facilities, the logical complement is internal access through compromised contractors. The DOE protocol revision was not preventive. It was responsive. They found something. The fact that the revision happened 6 months before the Senate testimony tells you the FBI has been building this picture for at least that long. What to watch for is whether surveillance expands or contracts. If FBI personnel levels near the 8 facilities increase over the next 30 days, the framework tells you that the threat assessment has elevated, but the strategic decision to avoid arrest remains intact. If briefings to state and local law enforcement expand to include additional facilities beyond the original 8, the framework tells you that the network is larger than currently acknowledged, and that the FBI is mapping it before deciding whether to roll it up. If Congress schedules closed-door testimony from the Director of National Intelligence or the Secretary of Energy, The framework tells you that the threat has cross-domain implications. In all three cases, the framework gives you a tool to interpret developments that will otherwise be reported as disconnected events. Why does this mechanism exist? Because modern counterintelligence operates in an environment where adversaries have diversified their response options faster than law enforcement has diversified its interdiction capabilities. 30 years ago, if you identified a foreign intelligence operative on U.S. soil, you arrested them, you declared them persona non grata, and the threat ended. That is no longer true. Operatives today are often not official cover. They are dual nationals, naturalized citizens, or long-term residents whose arrest triggers legal processes that expose sources and methods without guaranteeing conviction. More importantly, modern networks are built with redundancy. Arresting the operatives you can see does not dismantle the network. It forces the network to activate the operatives you have not yet identified. The mechanism exists because the intelligence threat has evolved faster than the legal framework for countering it. Surveillance without arrest is not a gap in capability. It is an adaptation to an adversary who has designed their operations to exploit the arrest process itself. And that is before we address what the deterrence strategy actually requires from the American side. The closest historical parallel is not sleeper cells pre-September 11th. It is the Cuban intelligence network operating in South Florida during the 1990s. The Wasp network consisted of Cuban intelligence officers and recruited agents who conducted surveillance on U.S. military installations, tracked Cuban exile groups, and monitored activity at key transportation hubs. The FBI identified members of the network as early as 1995. They were not arrested until 1998. For 3 years, the Bureau ran one of the longest counterintelligence surveillance operations on U.S. soil, watching operatives conduct daily intelligence activities without interdiction. The reason was identical to the current situation. Arresting the operatives the FBI had identified would have severed visibility into the network structure, triggering activation of operatives not yet under surveillance. What happened over those 3 years was a textbook example of the framework in action. The FBI identified over 24 operatives, mapped communication flows, documented dead drops, and intercepted tasking instructions. They turned at least one operative into a double agent, feeding controlled information back to Cuban intelligence while using the communication channel to identify additional handlers. The operation culminated in a coordinated arrest sweep in September 1998 that dismantled the network in a single night. 10 operatives were convicted. The network in Florida never reconstituted. The key to success was waiting until the surveillance picture was complete before moving to interdiction. The parallel is not that Iran and Cuba represent equivalent strategic threats. The parallel is that surveillance as a deliberate counterintelligence strategy has historical precedent and a documented success record. What is the same now is the adversary's use of long-term, low-profile operatives conducting surveillance rather than direct action. What is different is the target set. The Wasp network focused on military and logistical assets. The current Iranian network is positioned near infrastructure whose disruption carries regional and national impact. That difference changes the risk calculation. In the 1990s, the FBI had time to wait for the complete picture. The question in 2026 is whether the threat timeline allows the same patience. What is different now is the transparency of the surveillance itself. The Wasp network was not publicly acknowledged until arrests were made. The current Iranian operation was disclosed by the FBI director in open Senate testimony while the operatives remain free. That disclosure is strategic. It signals to Tehran that covert positioning has been detected and that continued operations occur under full American awareness. Let us step back from the specific operatives and look at what this means for the larger trajectory. The FBI is not waiting for Iranian intelligence to make a mistake. They are waiting to see whether diplomatic or military developments force a decision. Here is what happens if the United States and Iran move toward a negotiated framework that reduces tensions over nuclear development, regional proxy conflicts, or sanctions relief. In the next 48 hours, you will see whether back-channel communications increase or whether official diplomatic rhetoric softens. If either happens, it signals that both sides are creating space for de-escalation. The presence of the operatives near the nuclear facilities becomes a bargaining chip that Iran can withdraw as a confidence-building measure without conceding anything material. The FBI does not arrest them. Iran does not replace them. Both sides step back from the threshold. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, if negotiations continue, you will see reporting on security cooperation or information sharing between U.S. and Iranian officials through third-party intermediaries. The language will be vague, but the substance will be straightforward. Iran provides assurances that the operatives will be repositioned or recalled, and the United States provides assurances that economic or diplomatic concessions are under active consideration. The operatives disappear from surveillance, not because they were arrested, but because they were pulled. The FBI closes the case files without public acknowledgement. In the next 6 to 12 months, the long-term consequence of this path is a return to a managed adversarial relationship where both sides maintain intelligence operations against each other, but avoid crossing into directly threatening critical infrastructure. Iran retains the capability to reposition operatives if the diplomatic framework collapses. The United States retains the surveillance architecture to detect repositioning. The strategic landscape stabilizes at a lower level of tension. What was permanently changed is that both sides now know the other is willing to go to the threshold without crossing it. What reverts is the day-to-day operational environment, which returns to routine counterintelligence monitoring rather than crisis-level surveillance. Here is what happens if diplomatic efforts collapse and military or economic confrontation accelerates between the United States and Iran. In the next 48 hours, you will see whether the FBI increases surveillance personnel near the 8 facilities or whether the operatives alter their patterns in ways that suggest they have received new tasking. If surveillance expands, it means the FBI has intelligence indicating that the threat assessment has elevated and that the operatives may transition from surveillance to action preparation. If the operatives change their behavior, it means they have been instructed to signal capability rather than maintain a low profile. Both outcomes point to escalation. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, if confrontation continues, you will see arrests, not quiet removals, public arrests with Justice Department press releases, criminal complaints unsealed in federal court, and congressional briefings followed by selective leaks to national media. The arrests will be framed as disrupting an active plot, even if no plot was operationally imminent. The purpose is to demonstrate that the United States will not tolerate infrastructure threats regardless of diplomatic consequences. The operatives will be charged under espionage statutes, material support for terrorism, or both. In the next 6 to 12 months, a long-term consequence of this path is that Iran activates contingency networks that the FBI has not yet identified. The operatives under surveillance were the visible layer. Iranian intelligence does not build single-layer networks. Arrest triggers protocol. Secondary operatives who have maintained complete operational security and are unknown to U.S. counterintelligence receive activation orders. They do not position near the same 8 facilities. They target different infrastructure where surveillance is lighter and interdiction is slower. The FBI faces a larger, more distributed threat with fewer intelligence leads. What was permanently changed is that Iranian intelligence shifts from a deterrence-based strategy to an active measures strategy. The threshold that both sides avoided crossing in the first scenario gets crossed in this one, and neither side can step back. We are tracking every dimension of this here on this channel. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The mainstream tells you what happened today. We tell you what it means for tomorrow. The framework explains the posture. The historical parallel confirms the precedent. But the decision to surveil rather than arrest only holds as long as both sides believe the other will not force escalation. Surveillance without arrest is not hesitation. It is acceptance of the threat. That single sentence captures the entire strategic picture. The FBI is not failing to act. They are acting by choosing not to act in the way that political instinct demands. The question that all of this leads to, and that the next 48 hours will force an answer to, is whether the FBI's assessment of Iranian intent remains accurate, or whether operational conditions on the ground change in ways that make continued surveillance untenable. The story is not finished. The operatives are still in place. The FBI is still watching. And every day that passes without arrests is another day that the strategic calculation holds. In the next 48 hours, watch whether FBI surveillance teams near the 8 nuclear facilities increase in size, or whether staffing levels remain consistent with the current operational posture. If additional personnel deploy, that tells you the threat assessment has elevated and that the Bureau is preparing for a potential transition from monitoring to interdiction. If staffing remains steady, that tells you the FBI believes the current posture is sustainable and that the operatives are not receiving tasking that indicates imminent action. Both outcomes are visible to local law enforcement and to anyone monitoring federal vehicle patterns near the facilities. In the next week, watch whether state and local law enforcement agencies near the 8 sites receive updated briefings or whether the existing guidance from DHS remains unchanged. If updated briefings occur, they will appear as unexplained meetings between federal officials and county sheriffs, state police commanders, or emergency management directors. Local media in those areas will note the meetings even if the content is not disclosed. If briefings expand to law enforcement agencies near facilities beyond the original 8, that tells you the network is larger than the Senate testimony acknowledged. In the next month, watch the congressional testimony schedule. If the Senate Intelligence Committee or the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence schedule closed-door sessions with the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Energy, or the head of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that tells you the threat has expanded beyond counterintelligence into infrastructure resilience. Witness lists for classified briefings are published in committee calendars, even when the substance of the testimony is not. That is your signal. When FBI Director Marsh returns to Congress in early May for the routine budget hearing, the questions he receives will tell you whether the surveillance strategy is still politically tenable or whether pressure is building for public arrests. That hearing is already on the schedule. The analysis will be here. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Not a summary, not a headline repeat. Evidence, assessment, what it means for the trajectory, in that order. This is not a story about whether Iranian intelligence is operating on U.S. soil. That question is answered. This is a story about whether the United States can sustain a counterintelligence strategy that accepts visible risk in order to avoid invisible escalation. The answer depends on variables that are shifting in real time. What we are tracking is not just the operatives. We are tracking the decision points that determine whether surveillance remains the strategy or whether the United States concludes that the cost of watching has exceeded the cost of acting. Those decision points are visible if you know what signals matter. The FBI does not announce when it changes operational posture. It reallocates resources, updates guidance, and adjusts testimony language. Those adjustments are the story. When the next shift happens, the breakdown will be here, not speculation. Documentation of what changed, analysis of why it changed, and assessment of what the change means for the larger strategic picture. The next video in this series will cover whether the surveillance posture holds through the end of April, or whether one of the three signals in the next 30 days indicates a shift toward interdiction. The timeline is tight. The variables are moving. The story is not over. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. We will see you in the next. This is the Tactical Briefing.